Great, so I'm going to go ahead and start as those are being passed out. So like Andrew said, I'm Liz. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much for all of you who came to this session. I'm really looking forward to talking about faith. So today I want to talk about long-term commitments. And one thing is that the ability to keep a commitment over a long period of time, it seems like it's a pretty crucial aspect of our lives. There's a lot of things in our life, like going to grad school, losing weight, a marriage, religious commitment, that all require this ability to keep a commitment over a long period of time. However, there are obstacles to these sorts of commitments, and I want to focus on two main obstacles. So the first is counterevidence. Evidence that sort of challenges or defeats sort of part of the initial basis for the commitment originally. So is this really the best way to lose weight? Or does God really exist? That kind of thing. And the other kind of obstacle is a loss of desire. So even if this really is the best way to lose weight, is it worth giving up pizza? Or whether God exists or not, is God the type of person that I would want to commit my life to? Would God's existence be a good thing? So I want to focus on these two obstacles for these long-term commitments. And I want to argue that a particular understanding of three attitudes, belief, faith, and hope, can enable us to overcome these two types of obstacles. So my thesis is on your handout. It's that paradigm cases of belief, faith, and hope all play the same role in rationalizing action. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on action-oriented commitments, commitments to act in particular ways. I'm also going to focus on propositional versions of these states, so belief that, faith that, and hope that, where the object is a proposition. And finally, what I'm trying to do today is not about evaluating the rationality. There's handouts, so Andrew has extra. Perfect. Great. Sorry. So what I'm trying to do today is not about evaluating the rationality of belief or faith or hope, but instead, it's examining what kind of actions, certain combinations of having belief or having faith or having hope would rationalize in a particular agent. So this is sort of similar to decision theory. In decision theory, it takes your credences and your utility function as inputs, and then it says what kind of action should you take given you have those credences in that utility function. But it's not about evaluating the rationality of your credences or utility function. So that's kind of the model that I'm working with here, is that it's not about whether faith, belief, or hope are rational, but it's about what kind of actions those states would rationalize. So the main upshot of this picture that I want to focus on today is that it can explain how a commitment to act can be rational in the face of counterevidence or waning affections. There's a couple other upshots I'm going to talk about too. A second one is that on my picture, faith is going to be central to action-oriented commitments and more important than belief or hope. Belief or hope will still play an important role, but I think my account is going to give a special place to faith and its role in these long-term commitments. Okay, good. So first I'm going to talk about this attitude that's called acceptance and what justifies it, and then I'm going to sort of talk about belief, faith, and hope and what those look like, and basically try to argue that for all three attitudes, they sort of play the same role in rationalizing, accepting the propositions in question. And then I'm going to kind of talk about some of the big upshots of this picture. Okay, so section 2, what justifies acceptance. So accepting P is an attitude that people talk about in different contexts. Basically what it is, it's acting as if P. So what justifies acting as if some proposition is true? Well, at least two major theories of rational action give the same answer. And that is this, that rational action is a function of two inputs, an epistemic component and an axiological or affective component. And I'm going to talk about those two components in a second. But the two models I'm thinking of is like a decision theory model where credences and utilities are inputted, or a belief-desire model where beliefs and desires are inputted. So on decision theory, I mean, there's different decision rules you can use, but kind of the classic one is you should take the action that kind of maximizes expected value given your credences and your utility function. And then on a belief-desire model, the idea is that you should perform the actions that are appropriate or warranted given your beliefs and your desires. So on both of these models, rational action has two inputs, an epistemic one and an axiological or an affective one. So The epistemic component in some way represents the way the world is, so that would be like the agent's beliefs or credences. It's going to be kind of sensitive to evidence in a certain way. And one thing to note here that's pretty obvious is that acting as if some proposition is true can be rational, even if one has no desire at all for that proposition to be true, as long as you're confident or you have enough evidence that it's true. I mean, this happens all the time, right? So, failed the exam, so I better study for the retake, right? I missed my flight, so I better try to book a new one. So it's a kind of a not very interesting point. But a lot of times, just because our evidence strongly supports a particular proposition, that can make acting as if it's rational, even apart from any of our desires for that proposition to be true. Okay, so that's the epistemic component. The affective or axiological component is about what's valuable or desirable. So that would be like the agent's desires or utility function. And a little more of an interesting point here is that acting as if some proposition is true can be rational, even if your credence in that proposition is really, really low, as long as your desires or utility function is strong or high enough. That is, it would be very, very, very good if P were true. So I'm going to give a couple examples of this because it's maybe slightly less intuitive than the earlier point. So one example is, suppose your sibling goes missing. Your sibling has been missing for a long time, and you think it's very, very likely that your sibling is dead. But it would be obviously a very, very good thing if your sibling were alive and you found your sibling. So in this case, it can be rational for you to act as if your sibling is still alive by searching for him and putting up missing posters and going around and telling people, let's try to find him, let's try to find him, even if it's really, really unlikely that your sibling is still alive, as long as your credence isn't zero. So in this case, it can be rational to act as if your sibling's alive and try to go find him, even if you might even disbelieve that your sibling's alive, or you have a really, really low credence. Okay, a second case, so let's say you go on a hike, and you're hiking around, and then you get lost, and you start to run out of food, you start to run out of water, you're really worried, you won't be able to get back, and you finally find this path back, and you're like, this is the only way I know how to get back, but for some reason you just know, like, this path is the way to get back to civilization, but this path takes you to this really, really deep, really, really wide crevice, and it's your only chance at survival is to jump this crevice. So it could be rational for you to act as if you'll make the jump, even if you think it's pretty unlikely you'll make it, because it's your only chance at survival. So because of how good it would be if that proposition were true, it can be rational to act as if it's true, even if your evidence doesn't support it or even supports its negation. Okay, third case, final case. Let's suppose you're in a very snowy part of the country, and you live by a lake, and you take your kids out, and you go, and you're looking at this lake, and your kids are like, can we go play on the lake? Can we go play on the frozen lake? And, you know, let's say it's pretty cold, you're pretty confident the lake is pretty iced over, but those of you who are parents can probably testify you would not let your kid go play on the lake, even if you had enough evidence to believe the lake was iced over, because there's still some chance you could be wrong, and that would be really, really bad, especially if you have young kids. So your credence can be very, very low that the ice will break, but it can still be rational for you to act as if the ice will break and make your kids stay far, far away. Okay, so the main overall point is acting as if P can be rational, even if your credence in P is very low. Okay, cool. So now we've kind of touched on both of these components. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that rational action is a function of these two components, and then argue that paradigm cases of belief, faith, and hope all entail accepting P. Okay, one objection to this assumption. So some of you might be familiar with like Laura Bouchek's work in decision theory. So Laura Bouchek argues that decision theory shouldn't just have inputs of credences and utilities, but it should also have a third function that's a risk function. And it kind of represents agents' attitudes to worst-case scenarios. And so Bouchek thinks, look, epistemic and effective, that's not enough to get all the right results in every case. We need this third factor, this risk function. And so you might think that's potentially problematic or a problem for my assumption since I'm assuming rational action is just a function of these two components. Okay, so in reply, this third component actually makes Bouchek's decision theory more permissive rather than less permissive. So she basically every epistemic effective combination that I say will make an action rational, she will also say makes an action rational. She just thinks there can be even more cases where actions can be rational. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with like the Allais paradox, but basically what she's trying to do is say that agents in certain situations that traditional decision theory would say are acting irrationally, that those agents can actually be rational. Because of their risk attitudes. So, but the point is, her account is more permissive rather than less permissive than mine, and so this actually isn't a problem, and if you like her view, it could actually even help me, because it would mean that even more cases of belief, faith, and hope rationalize action rather than less. So, for the sake of simplicity, and just kind of because it's like the more classical view, I'm going to assume that rational action is only a function of the two components, but I think everything that I say here is totally consistent with someone liking Bouchek's picture more. Okay, great. So now we're going to move on to section 3 and talk about the relationship between belief and acceptance. So belief in general has a pretty high epistemic standard. Usually when you believe, you have fairly strong evidence that the proposition you're believing is true, because when you believe, you're kind of committing to the world being a certain way. The world is such that P. So pretty high epistemic standard. However, belief has no implications for desire. And we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of things we believe, even though we have no desire for them to be true. But nonetheless, the fact that belief has this pretty high epistemic standard is going to make acceptance rational in paradigm cases of belief. And like Cohen, the main person who kind of works on the belief-acceptance distinction, even says, usually we accept what we believe and believe what we accept. Usually these two things kind of go hand in hand. But also, this is supported by a recently popular kind of view of belief that says when you believe that P, this often involves kind of a disposition to treat P as true in your reasoning. So Ross and Schroeder sort of have this view. And I think a lot of people with this view say believing P involves a disposition to treat P as true in your reasoning, but this isn't a feasible disposition. So in these crazy high-stakes cases, you might believe P, but you won't accept P. So think about like the frozen ice case, for example. You believe the ice is solid, but you're not going to act as if the ice is solid because of the stakes, because of how bad it would be if your kid fell through the ice. So if the stakes are high with respect to not P and low with respect to P, it can be rational to act as if not P, even if you believe P, as long as you don't have credence 1 in P. That was kind of the complicated way of putting it. You can just think about the example if that was a mouthful. So anyway, it's not going to be that belief and acceptance never come apart. At the same time, paradigm cases of believing P are going to entail accepting that P, and they're usually going to kind of stand together. Okay, so belief usually justifies acceptance. Now let's talk about a little more interesting attitude and the topic of this session, faith. So one of the big controversies in the faith literature, I think this might be handout flipping time. Yeah, backside of your handout, section 4. So one of the big controversies in the faith literature is whether faith entails belief, kind of this relationship between belief and faith. And some people kind of like, and some people might even be talking about this later, like this belief plus model where faith is belief plus some other things like maybe an effective attitude towards the proposition, maybe some other stuff. And other people want to say, no, you can have faith at P even if you don't believe P. So I guess broadly, I don't want to take a stand on this controversy, and I don't think my arguments in this paper require me to take a stand on this. But I think just for funsies, I'm going to assume that faith at P doesn't entail belief at P. And there's two reasons for this. So the first is that if faith is belief plus some other stuff, that makes my thesis easier. It's kind of stacking the deck in my favor, because I've already sort of argued there's a connection between belief and acceptance, and this I'll like have to give a new argument. There's a connection between faith and acceptance, so I don't want to stack the deck in my favor. But also, I think my model ends up being more interesting if you can have faith without belief, and I'll get to that in the last section when I sort of talk about the upshots. But I think it's a cooler picture if you can have faith without belief. That's not to say you can't embrace my thesis even if you like belief plus. But I'm just going to assume you can have faith without belief for the sake of the talk. Okay, so given this assumption, faith, I think it's natural to think that faith has a weaker epistemic component than belief, in that faith would require less evidence or be consistent with a lower credence than belief. Like if you believe P and then you get some counter evidence such that you can no longer believe P, you could still have faith that P. And I think this is actually like kind of one motivation for denying the belief plus model. So weaker epistemic component than belief, but it's going to have a stronger affective component than belief, because faith that P, almost everyone in the faith literature acknowledges when you have faith that P, you have to have some kind of desire for P to be true. So one example to sort of illustrate this, so let's say like my friend's running a marathon, and I'm like, oh man, I have faith you're going to win, I have faith you're going to win, but I really hope you lose. You know, like that seems kind of weird. And I think if you really embrace this idea that I hope my friend loses the marathon, it's hard to see in what sense I have faith that she would win the marathon. So for this kind of reason, a lot of people think if you have faith that some proposition is true, that what comes along with that is a desire for that proposition to be true. So faith has a weaker epistemic component than belief, but a stronger affective component than belief. And so because faith, kind of relative to the other two attitudes, has sort of this moderate epistemic component, I do think that if you get too much counter-evidence, you should give up your faith. And then this moderate affective component, like I just talked about, I think faith that P, this is my strong thesis at least, faith that P is going to entail rationally accepting that P. So the thought here is that if you have faith that P, it would be irrational not to act as if P. So last time I gave this talk, I got a lot of pushback here, so I'm gonna say a couple things about it and then maybe step back a little bit if you guys think this is too strong. But one thing to say about this tight connection between faith and acceptance is that what accepting a proposition looks like isn't always totally straightforward, right? So it's going to depend on kind of like a holistic picture of an agent's beliefs and desires. So here's an example, like let's say someone accepts God exists. That doesn't mean they're going to go out and try to like proselytize to everyone they know necessarily, because a lot of it's going to depend on more specific things about what they believe about God and what they believe God wants for them. And it's totally reasonable to say someone accepts God exists, but like maybe they work at a public school and they like don't go around telling everyone about their beliefs at that school, because you kind of have to look at a holistic picture of their mental states. So it's not always, what it means to accept P isn't always going to be straightforward. That said, I think there might be some worries in the neighborhood sort of along these lines. So let's say you have faith that P, and I give you this bet, I'll give you $1 if P, and I'll torture you for 100 years if not P. Does faith require you to take that bet? I think that's actually a pretty tough challenge. And other people have wanted to draw this connection between faith and acceptance, so I think it's kind of a challenge for a number of us. So there's two responses here. So one is, yes, actually faith does require you to take that bet. And if you don't take the bet, it's evidence you've kind of given up your faith at P, but that might be totally rational given you've encountered that bet. This response, I think, could explain why we praise people who don't give up their commitments in the face of remarkable odds. So think about like the martyr tradition, for example, people that they're faced with some cost, but they don't give up their faith anyway. I think if you wanted to draw this tight connection between faith and acceptance, you could kind of explain why we sort of say, wow, they have really, really amazing faith because they're willing to continue to accept P even in the face of these crazy odds. But you might think, no, that's too strong. Faith can't require that. You could still have faith, but just encounter this crazy bet, and it just seems totally irrational for you to take it. And I'm pretty sympathetic to that. And so I think in response, I would just sort of want to weaken the link between faith and acceptance and say, look, there are some crazy cases where faith doesn't require you to accept, but faith and acceptance are still going to have a really, really close connection. And I think this isn't a big deal for the main thing I want to argue, which is that faith plays an important role in helping us maintain these long-term commitments. But faith and acceptance that's consistent with thinking there's these crazy cases where faith and acceptance come apart in cases that most of us probably won't actually encounter. So So like I said, on the handout it says faith that P entails rational acceptance that P, but I'm willing to back down on that a little bit for these crazy cases. So maybe you could think I have like a stronger thesis and a weaker thesis, depending on where you want to go on that. Okay, either way though, faith that P and acceptance that P are going to be really, really closely connected. Okay, so the final attitude that I want to talk about is hope. So now we're in section 5. So hope has a weaker epistemic component than faith. Most people who work on hope acknowledge hope is hoping for P is consistent with a very, very low credence in P. A lot of people in the hope literature, I think, still think that hope requires a belief that P is possible, or at least a non-zero credence in P. But you can have a super low credence in P and still have hope. So I think the epistemic component of hope is much weaker than that of faith. At the same time, hope has a very, very, very strong affective component, and kind of one of the central features of hoping is the desire for the object of hope. So if you hope that P, one of the central features of that is a desire for P to be true. And I think like one interesting question is whether this desire is at least in general stronger than that of faith. And I think there's 2 reasons to think it is. So the first, if hope and faith, so if hope has the same affective component as faith, it starts to kind of look like faith's little brother, because you have faith at P, you get some counter-evidence, your credence goes down, and then you just hope. But there's nothing like special or distinctive about hope, and I don't think that's the right way to think about hope. I think hope has kind of its own unique power that faith might not have. And if you have this view on which hope has a stronger affective component than faith, then it can explain why hope has a unique power and distinctiveness that faith doesn't have. The second reason to think that hope's affective component is stronger than faith's is that I think some in the hope literature, sort of one puzzle that they talk about is this puzzle that how can hope have this distinct motivating force when you're in these dire circumstances, when it seems like the probability of whatever you're hoping for is super, super low. Like, we really want to, we're in this horrible circumstance, we really want to get out, but it's like really unlikely we'll get out, but we still have hope, And how can hope motivate you to get through these really hard times? And one explanation is that hope's affective component is the thing that can motivate you to get out of those things. And so I think if you think hope's affective component is really strong, even stronger than that of faith, it can explain how hope has this unique motivating force when you're in these really, really horrible circumstances. So there's at least 2 reasons to think that hope's affective component is even stronger than that of faith's. And so for this reason, because hope at least has some epistemic component and a very strong affective component, in many cases, hope that P is going to entail rationally accepting that P. So here's an example. I really hope my student turns his paper in on time, right? Maybe I have a ton of evidence that my student won't turn his paper in on time. Maybe my student has not turned any papers in on time for the entire semester. But nonetheless, because it would be so good if my student turned this last paper in on time, I'm going to still go ahead and assign him to a peer review group. So I'm going to accept the proposition in question, even though its probability is super, super low, because of how good it would be if the student actually did turn his paper in on time. So nonetheless, I think all cases of hope don't require acceptance. Probably less cases of hope require acceptance than cases of faith or belief. But I still think there's a decent number of cases where hoping P can make accepting P rational. Okay. So I'm at about 24 minutes. That's perfect. Okay, so now I want to talk about a couple upshots of this picture. So there's a chart, I think, near the bottom of your handout, where I basically outline these 3 attitudes and their epistemic and affective requirements. And if you notice, the epistemic requirement sort of starts high and goes lower. The affective requirement goes from none to very high. And because of this sort of like inverse relationship between the epistemic and affective requirements, it's going to mean that most cases of belief, all or almost all cases of faith, and many cases of hope entail rationally accepting P. And so I think this is cool. I think this picture is cool because it can explain the diachronic rationality of these commitments that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk. Marriage and completing grad school and going on a diet, those kinds of things. And it can explain how these long-term commitments can overcome obstacles, both waning affections and counterevidence. So in the case of waning affections, one can be justified in accepting P, even in light of losing desire for P to be true. You kind of start off, you're hoping, and you have faith, and you believe, and then you kind of like lose desire, and then you kind of like, well, now I just kind of believe. But you can still act as if P, because like I said, many cases of belief rationalize acceptance. So I think this is kind of characteristic of a lot of our commitments. So many of the commitments we make, we kind of start off with this very strong desire or affect that motivates the initial commitment. So think about like beginning a diet, you're like, I'm hyped, let's go, let's like give up cake, or getting married, you're like super in love and going on a honeymoon, or like your first semester of grad school. But then things get tough and you're like, I don't know if I want this anymore, this is really hard, I really like cake. Writing seminar papers sucks, whatever. And we lose desire over time, but our beliefs can enable us to stick to these commitments even if our desires have faded. And I think some people sort of, maybe when they're giving advice, maybe it's a little cliche, but sometimes they say like, you have to rely on what you know, not just your feelings, not just kind of your waning affections. And I think this might be kind of what they're getting at, that sometimes our beliefs can sort of be this solid foundation even when our desires are kind of moving up and down. And this can be an important part of long-term commitments. Okay, the second way that the second obstacle to long-term commitments is counterevidence. And in the case of counterevidence, I think my account can explain how we can be justified in accepting P even as we lose evidence that P, as long as the evidence doesn't make us go all the way down to probability 0 for P. So we might like initially believe God exists, for example, and then we start getting evidence against that, the problem of evil, or stuff like that, and you move down to faith, maybe you get even more counter-evidence, and you find yourself in a place where maybe your credence that God exists is like 0.2 or something. It's pretty low. Maybe you can't even have faith anymore. But nonetheless, because of how good it would be if God did exist, I think you can still be rational in certain religious practices, going to church, prayer. Kleinschmidt, what's her first name? Shiva Kleinschmidt, thank you. And there's a couple other people that I didn't cite, but I have in the paper, who talk about these cases where you have a very, very low credence, or maybe even you consider yourself an atheist, but certain these action-oriented commitments can still be rational for you. So I think that's kind of the big upshot that I wanted to talk about, was the diachronic rationality of commitment in the face of those two obstacles. A couple other upshots I wanted to touch on. I think I have a few more minutes. So the first is that in a key sense, faith is the most powerful or stable attitude rather than belief or hope, because faith kind of has a more stable epistemic requirement and a more stable affective requirement. And like I argued for before, faith always or almost always rationalizes acceptance and does so more than belief or hope. And I think this makes sense, because I think a lot of times when we think about long-term commitments, what do we think we need for those? Well, we need faith. And so I think my account can kind of explain why that's true and bring that out nicely. So second, my account brings out something about rational acceptance. So Bill Alston, some of you might be familiar with, has this kind of influential paper on faith where he argues that acceptance, rather than belief, is the primary cognitive component of faith, especially religious faith. And when you read the paper, he kind of seems to be treating acceptance as kind of like this sui generis cognitive attitude that's like playing this role that like people thought belief was playing. And so I think contra Alston, I want to say I don't think acceptance is like a cognitive attitude, but I think rather it's a non-fundamental result of particular combinations of our epistemic and affective states. So I agree with Alston that there's a close connection between faith and acceptance, but I disagree that acceptance is the cognitive or epistemic attitude that's the key part of faith. And so I think Instead, the picture I've painted on which faith often always or often leads to acceptance is a more plausible way of capturing the spirit of Alston's plausible and attractive suggestion that acceptance rather than belief plays a crucial role in faith. Okay, great. So I've argued that belief, faith, and hope all play the same role in rationalizing long-term commitments to act over time. I've shown that on 2 classical models of practical rationality. Rational action is a function of the epistemic and the affective. So this enables a model in which belief, faith, and hope can all play the same role in making acceptance rational. And in this, our long-term projects can overcome 2 major obstacles, the loss of evidence and the loss of desire. Thanks. How if we were doing it all at the end or now, but yeah.
If there are any after that.
All right, sit down. It's also okay if there's not questions. Yeah, Andrew.
So do you believe that belief that P and hope that P entails faith?
Oh, interesting. I had never thought about that before. So if you believe P and you have hope that P, do you have faith? I think it depends on your theory of faith. And so part of what I was doing here was just giving kind of necessary conditions for these attitudes, maybe not sufficient. So I think it depends on if, I was thinking, faith, there's 2 necessary conditions, kind of a moderate affective component and then and a moderate epistemic component. So I think it kind of depends on maybe if you want to build additional things in for whatever would make those jointly sufficient. But I guess I would kind of think maybe, why not? But yeah, I don't know, that's interesting. Did you think there was a certain...
I thought maybe if you
Yeah.
don't go in the blue check way, then I think you might entail that. I wasn't sure though, and then it'd be an interesting way to try to come up with counterexamples. So I hear the case where I believe in P, but I don't have faith in P.
Yeah, so I think, like I said, part of it depends on the sufficient conditions for faith. But I'm definitely open to that, and I think that's a really interesting thing to pursue, and I've actually never thought about that question, so that's cool, yeah. Yeah.
Oh. So, thank you for the question.
Yeah.
I'm very unfamiliar with the topic, but some of your questions are good.
No.
So I have 2 questions. One is more general. One is about what is justification? It seems that you equalize the justification of action and the action is rational.
Yeah.
So these 2 are the same for you.
Yeah, I was using them interchangeably. I think some people distinguish. Actually, my advisor probably distinguishes between those. Robert Audi likes to, but
irrational actions are justified. For example, in the missing sibling case, I'm less inclined to say the belief that my sibling is still alive is rational, but I still think it's just the action of continuing looking for my sibling is justified. So that's my intuition.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the belief is neither rational nor justified, and the action is both rational and justified. Does that make sense? Maybe I explained it too fast, but yeah, the thought is that even though you shouldn't believe given your evidence and you don't believe, you can still nonetheless act as if your sibling is alive because of how good it would be if your sibling was alive and you found them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then in that case, is my belief that my sibling is still alive?
No, you don't believe. Yeah. Depending on how you spell the case, you could either say, I'm agnostic about it, or even I don't think my sibling's still alive, there's too much evidence against it, but there's a chance I'm wrong, and because of that chance, I'm going to still try to go find my sibling. Does that make sense? Sorry if I explained that too quickly.
I think so. And the second question, about the word faith, do you use it in belief and hope can be used in both very serious areas of life with, but it seems that faith, to believe and hope, belief and hope can be used also in pretty like trivial aspects of life, like pizza eating is good for diet. So I can believe in it, I can hope it, but it's a little weird to say I have faith in that pizza eating is good for diet. So I'm just wondering how does the word faith apply to different areas of life, different level of seriousness.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's interesting. I guess I haven't thought a ton about this, but yeah, maybe we do apply believe and hope. I mean, believe is like applied very trivially, I think, to like lots of different things. Maybe hope too. Like, I hope that restaurant has tacos, you know? So faith, yeah, so that could actually be a different way. If you're right about that faith kind of has like a unique distinctive power for these like really important long-term commitments that belief and hope don't. I mean, it still seems like there could be some like more trivial cases of faith. I mean, kind of going on a diet is, I mean, it's important to some people, I guess, but it's not as important maybe as like a marriage or something. But yeah, so it might, but yeah, if you're right about faith, that could be like an additional way that faith sort of has a unique status that belief and hope don't have. So yeah, that's cool. Good question. I think I saw your hand first.
Sure. Thanks for that. I
Yeah.
was just interested in your approach to accepting.
And
And I just wanted to ask you about it. So
Yeah.
it seems quite closely tied to action. In fact,
Yeah.
defined as acting as if be.
Mm-hmm.
And my sort of typical way that I would think about acceptance and similar types of attitudes is just taking something to be true, and that will probably give you, say, like a disposition to act as if be, and then so because you have this worry at the end of the faith section, you say, a lot of people raise this concern, faith at the entails and rational response. It might not be too much of a problem if it's just a disposition to act as if be, because that's easily overridden by countervailing considerations, moral considerations.
Yeah.
Being disposed to act as if P is sometimes to assert that P, but you don't always want to be doing that if it means that you're going to end up sort of lying and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you might have this disposition, but it's easily overridden, and I wonder if that came into play in some of those objections that you've been thinking about there. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so I mean, well, I do want to maintain that there's a difference between belief and acceptance. So if acceptance is just taking something to be true, I guess it's sort of unclear what distinguishes it from belief. But you might think something very close is accepting, which is like taking something to be true in your practical reasoning or something. But I think that's much closer to like the picture of acceptance I was going for. So, but I think your suggestion that it's kind of like a defeasible disposition to take it as true in your practical reasoning is like another way you could go. But I was like, yeah, so I definitely, maybe I should also put that in there as like a second sort of fallback, but I wanted to kind of hopefully push for something a little stronger than that, because like a defeasible disposition is kind of cheap. Like, you know, it could be overridden in like a lot of circumstances, like more than I would want. So yeah, maybe there would be a way to like make it a little bit stronger. I think actually last time I gave this talk, someone gave a similar suggestion. Maybe Dan Howard-Schneider actually told me to do something similar. So it's well taken, and maybe I should include that in the paper. Yeah. Right. But yeah, no, that's helpful and something I could put under as like a second kind of fallback to that objection. So I appreciate that. Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Good talk. I guess I have two questions that I think are related. One is just wondering about the justification for the claim that hope involves a weaker epistemic component than faith. I mean, I agree that hope is consistent with very low frequency, but I wonder about the source of the intuitions for why faith isn't consistent with a very low frequency. And
Yeah.
so then you get into this question, like, where do you draw the line, where
Yeah.
does it shade down from faith to hope? And then, so another question would be, look, there are these two basic dimensions. There's your probability judgments and then your utilities. Can you just you could talk about everything you want to talk about just using decision theory.
Yep.
Okay? Credences and
Oh my gosh,
utilities.
sorry.
Um,
I don't know what I just did. Sorry, keep going.
I mean, so maybe belief, faith, and hope would still be useful sort of qualitative indicators of where you are on these two dimensions, but I mean, you could just do without talk of faith, belief, and hope, and just.
Yeah.
Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, I'm pretty open to that. I mean, again, I said like I'm giving necessary conditions, so there could be
Yeah,
additional
right,
sufficient
right.
Sorry, I'll take your questions in reverse order. So there could be additional sufficient conditions, but yeah, I mean, one thing I've been actually like kind of interested lately is just kind of like the structure of the mind and which mental states are fundamental and which are still important and still really crucial for a bunch of things, but kind of can be reduced to combinations of these more fundamental mental states. And part of me is sort of sympathetic to a picture on which we kind of have like the affective things and the epistemic things, and then like we can build a bunch of stuff up out of those two. And I think it's really important to say that's not to say that faith or hope or any of these things aren't important, but it's just like, I guess I don't know why I need to like posit all these extra fundamental mental states when I can kind of, it has the same explanatory power. So yes, the second question I think I'm friendly to. Yeah, the first question is interesting, and I guess I didn't really argue for that. I was kind of assuming that, and I guess I was just thinking in a lot of our everyday uses of the term faith, this came up at the conference we were at, actually. So someone tried to argue that you could believe not P, but still have faith at P. So I think part of it is going to depend on where you kind of fall on that debate, because I do think, well, I'm I'm a fallibilist about belief, so I don't think belief just means like credence zero, or disbelief means credence, believing not P, yeah. Yeah, so I do think you could believe not P, but nonetheless have hope that P, as long as your credence in P wasn't zero. But you might think, well, look, when it comes to faith, you can't have faith at P and believe not P. So that would be one potential answer, but like the guy who gave this talk had some interesting considerations there too. So I'm open to the idea that, I'm open to the idea that I should think more about this, but that's at least one potential reason. So, yeah, good question. Michael? Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So that was fun. I've got a question about whether acting as if it seems like some of the paper sounds as if the thought is that you're going to act as if something's true if you, maybe if and only if you hope that it's true and enough, and you have enough evidence that it's true, so it's kind of epistemic and effective. But it strikes me that that's not quite the way to explain acting as if. Because really what it's about is the outcomes that depend on whether P is true or not. And those aren't going to always be, so it's a different question, like how much you value the outcomes that depend on whether P is true, given what you do, versus whether you actually hope that P is true or not.
Oh.
So let me give you some examples.
Yeah.
The pizza case is a good example. Like you might really, it's worthy of hope that pizza is a super healthy for you, right?
Yeah.
That's not the way you should.
You shouldn't act, yeah.
Act as if that's true. Not at all. Right?
Good, yeah.
And like, I was thinking too about, that global warming is human caused and a serious problem.
Yeah.
Like that's a terrible thing to hope for. In fact, you should hope that's not true. But you ought to act as if it's true, because if it's true, it's something you want to believe. You want to be committed to actions that will stop it.
Good.
It's not to be hoped for.
Good. We're on the same page in that we're both thinking about rational acceptance and not just acceptance period, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, no, this is a really good point. I think I agree. So, I mean, one thing to say is like, yeah, like, I wasn't trying to claim all cases of hope or all cases of belief are going to entail accepting the proposition in question, and I mean, when you think about, I guess, the cases I'm interested in that are kind of these long-term commitment cases, it might look slightly different than sort of the cases you're bringing up. But I do want to think more about, like the God exists case, I think is a good one where, you know what I mean, you can lose affection or lose evidence, and I think that the proposition in question sort of the same. But yeah, I think basically I want to think more about the outcomes thing, because I think that's a good point. I think you articulate. I had this sort of worry in the neighborhood, and I think you just articulated exactly what I was worried about. So we should talk more about this. Sweet, Andrew.
We're hoping to win the lottery, for instance.
Yeah.
About hope, and you
Yeah.
just mentioned God's existence. So
Yeah.
presumably, if God exists necessarily.
Mm.
So it's a necessary truth that God exists.
Uh-huh.
So then it's either necessarily true or necessarily false that God exists. Right?
Okay, sure.
So if you believe it's possible that God exists, then you believe it's not necessarily false that God exists. So that means insofar as you believe it's possible, you believe that God does exist. So hope can't involve believing that it's possible.
If you're aware of certain other premises, then have drawn the conclusion from those premises, I guess. I mean, there's also epistemic versus metaphysical possibility.
Yeah.
So you could think it's epistemically possible, but not.
So it depends.
Yeah.
Partly I was wondering what the possibility is.
Yeah, it's epistemic for sure.
It's epistemic.
Yeah.
So
So it's kind of
you know.
Yeah, it's or just on your evidence if you think evidence and knowledge come apart. But yeah, so it's going to be a relation between your evidence and then beliefs you form about possibilities.
So could you hope for a miracle? People seem to hope for miracles, and yet they know enough about nature and so forth that if it turns out that it's false, they know that it's false, that a miracle will occur.
Wait, so can you say more? Sorry.
So presume you think that we have some causal knowledge, like I know that seas do not part, or I know that this sea will not part such that I can walk through on dry land. Right? I know enough about nature and the laws and the background conditions and so forth. So a lot of theories of justification would make it the case that if it turns out to be true that this does not part, this sea does not part, then I know because I have good reasoning, good background knowledge and so forth. But surely I can still hope.
Yeah. I have this weird view of knowledge where you can say I know P, but there's a chance I'm wrong, and it comes down to some other comments I have about the relationship between belief and credence and stuff. But basically, so I think you could be given stuff I know, the sea won't part, but what if there's some chance that God exists and then the sea could part and that kind of thing. So.
That changes the story.
Oh, maybe it does. Yeah. Well, so that's why I was wanting to say that evidence and what you know might come apart. Maybe sorry. Maybe I'm not connecting with your question. We should talk more about it later. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we should thank Liz.
Thanks.